Chapter 4. So Soto played without his queen, but despite its absence, it did not deter his confidence nor his concentration. It forced him to be more creative, and despite it, he played on, and he played marvelously. And I could feel myself losing the game with each passing second. He moved his pawns near the center, then he moved his knights. After more moves, we finally reached mid-game. There were no open spaces from either side, and like most of his games, the board seemed crowded with confusion. But Soto remained calm. We sat and played. It was long and awful. He sat up straight and warmed his hands by constantly blowing into them. He wore a heavy deerskin that wrapped around his shoulder. He took in long, deep breaths and heavy sighs. He looked as if he could die at any moment. He moved his pawns up to the center. I countered with my knights. He remained silent. You've seemed to master this game, Sardina. At least its beginnings. About time. Took you long enough. I broke the silence and asked the obvious. You look pained, Soto. I am. You look as well. I am. What did you find in the desert? I found nothing. Well, you didn't look hard enough. There's plenty. There's nothing, Soto. No, there is plenty. I am the ruler of this entire land. I've killed all kings. This is my dominion, and there is plenty. I will kill all those who dare to take it away from me. That is my testament, Sardina. There is no other. After Napituca, the Spanish headed further north. They came upon another land that was low in elevation and contained deep and long rivers. They entered through swamps, dunes, and coasts, and afterward, they saw the ocean. In due time, Canale's men merged with Balthazar's. Hector and Vicente greeted their new comrades with nods and handshakes, but Balthazar's men were reluctant to reciprocate. Onward the army trekked, yet in all that time, they found no gold. For an entire month, the expedition trekked the land north to Apalache, but it came at a price. About 8 men had died from their wounds. Another 4 men were beritted with scurvy. On several days, the land possessed no food at all, and although it was autumn, the heat lasted from dawn until twilight. The men looked pained, frail, and gaunt. They looked like walk-in skeletons, wrapped in pounds of steel, and their march slowed to a crawling halt. For many days, Soto said not a word to any of his captains. It was Balthazar who broke the streak. "Sir," said Balthazar, "sir, the men are starving. General, General, Don Hernando, please listen to me." But Soto merely stared. "General, can't you see what's before you? You won't have an army if you starve them more." And once again, Soto ignored him and commanded his army forward. The next day arrived, and it was Moscoso's turn to approach Soto. "Sir, General, Don Hernando." "Yes, I'm listening." "The men are starving, sir. Our rations simply cannot contain us any further. We must find food from elsewhere." Our men are stronger than you realize, Luis. They'll be fed plenty. But, sir, just a little longer. No less than a week. But where? Where are we going, General? And again, Soto left in silence. 2 days later, they reached a tiny village that was only a mile away from the coast. The village had no chief, and because it was so small, there was a limited amount of food. With great reluctance, Soto accepted the village and their paltry gifts of dried corn. In the streams, the Spanish caught tiny fish. Towards the shore, the Spanish caught clams, small flounders, and bluefish. At night, the men made camp and slept. They were too weak to do anything else. But again, Soto remained alone. His chessboard rested along his side, and his pieces were scattered in a quandary that he alone could understand. In the morning, Tanako, a subordinate of Anasco, approached Soto. But he, too, suffered the same fate. "Don Hernando," said Tanako. "At last I found you. Soto gave one hard, ominous glare, but Tanako did not get the hint. "Our men are concerned about—" Then Soto took Tanako by his shoulder and threw him to the ground. He drew his sword, kicked Tanako in his stomach, and barked and shouted at him. Then Soto inched the top of his blade to Tanako's head. "I told you, I did not want to be disturbed. You did not listen. Do this again once more, I dare you. You'll know what will happen. Now get up." Tanako groveled and remained on the ground, and Soto kicked him once more. "Disturb me one more time, and I shall cut your fingers. Pray forgiveness comes your way." And with that, Tanako got up to his feet, saluted, and made it back to his horse. From then on, no one dared to speak to Soto at all. 2 nights passed. The captains gathered around a fire. All were present, except for Moscoso. He remained on watch with the cavalry. The men grunted and said their words in dank darkness. All were agitated and sad. There's too much that could go wrong here. There's too much going wrong right now. For once I agree with you, Balthazar. This makes no sense. Why are we waiting here? Those were our orders. But they were not Don Hernando's orders. They were given by Moscoso. It doesn't make sense to bring the entire army northward. I will never question the general's better judgment, but there's sometimes... Yes, I know. We all know. It's his absence that gets me. That's what I fear most. No one can speak to him. He doesn't want an advisement. It's as if he's lost in his own world. I keep waiting for the Indians to ambush us, but Don Hernando seems not to care. Have any of you spoken with him? No one? Just Moscoso. Where is that bastard? I saw him yesterday by the river bend. His men guard the perimeter. And so why are we left at camp? We should be further out. There's more land than anyone can possibly imagine. I haven't spoke to him since we left Florida. That was a month ago, said Anasco. Moscoso gives me my orders. It's as if he's the only one he speaks to. I guess all we can do is wait for our next orders, whatever they may be. But I believe Don Hernando's got us this far. I still trust him. More days came, more days died, and the sopping morning dew proved thick and everlasting. During those days, the army came upon many villages. Upon first impression, it seemed that the Spanish would again slaughter each village, but with great reluctance, Soto held court, and the Indians accepted the Spanish as their guest. However, on more than one occasion, the villagers remained at a distance, and sometimes they simply disappeared into the ravines. While they rested, the Spanish ate. They ate corn and beans and ravished upon the meat of lean deers. They melted raw grains into a starchy white gruel and ate heaps of it at a time. To the villagers, the Spanish looked like starved and ravaged animals, mainly because they were. And as Ortiz spoke with the villagers, Soto remained close to his side. 2 translators stood by the chief as the line of translation formed, and Soto listened intently. As night fell, they set up camp, made fires, and kept watch. And as the night continued, a fervent murmur ran through the air. In the smoke, the old men gambled the night away, and the younger men stared at the village girls who danced naked amongst the fires. Soto remained with Ortiz and the villagers. He sat next to them and stared across a great bush of fire. Again, the village told the story, and slowly, Ortiz began to understand. For half an hour, the villagers spoke, but they did not speak with pride or exuberance. Instead, they spoke in flat and truthful tones, and their eyes were of forthright conviction. Then Soto finally asked the obvious. "What is it, Ortiz? What are they saying?" "Tales," said Ortiz. "What tales?" "Tales of the land up ahead. They say it's a kingdom. They say it's rich and beautiful." "What is this land called?" asked Soto. "The land is called Conquistadors. It is ruled by a benevolent queen." "Where is this land?" "They say it's about a month march away." And when Ortiz finished, a look of calm came over Soto's face. The captains looked back at Soto from a distance. And as the word of Conquistadors was spread, the Spanish huddled over fire after fire and spent countless hours with priests and translators. The next morning, Soto donned a new coat made of wolfskin. Moscoso rode up to him. He asked Soto about his concerns about the food supply, but Soto merely shrugged. Luis kindly asked again, and Soto finally replied. "There will be plenty, Luis. She will provide." "Who is she, Don Hernando?" "The lady." "The lady?" "Yes, the lady. The lady of Conquistadors." "That's over 3 weeks' journey." "Which is why we must march now, Luis. Order your men. We must leave this place at once. Onward to Conquistadors. She will provide." Early autumn came and went, and the army marched north along the coast. 5 more Spanish died of hunger. 20 more fell ill. Slogs of clay and dirt sank their progress, and the more inland the Spanish drew, the harder the terrain. Days and miles later, they plodded through abandoned fields of rye and wheatgrass, and yellow and brown clusters of straw. The air seemed clearer, though, and for nearly 10 days, it did not rain at all. The cannons and artillery crew seemed to be days off course, and with great anger, Soto ordered Anasco and the other cavalry to go back and assist them. The horses slumped and strained as they carried the excess gear. Later, they were replaced by mules. 2 more weeks had passed, but with great relief, the Spanish had finally arrived at Conquistadors. The slaves had pointed and cheered, and it took some time for the Spanish to adjust their eyes. The land itself was a raw wonder. The first thing they noticed were abundant fields of tended crops. There were acres and acres of squash and corn, and the further they went, the more elevation they endured. The hills grew longer within the arches and slopes, and the soil was dark and dense and filled with earthly promise. The town itself stretched for tens of miles. Massive houses and barracks made of wood and straw stood through its center, and the Spanish looked at each other, relieved. But they were not at all joyous. Their eyes were still filled with anger and pain. Hut after hut stretched on for miles, and clearly, it seemed that the population was more than 10,000. Natives of all ages and types came out from their huts and looked on at the Spanish. Most of them walked naked, yet their appearance and bodies were much wider than those of the Napituca and Osita. They all looked stronger and much more intimidating. The Spanish made their initial offerings, and the head tribesmen greeted them with great restraint. In time, the sounds of loud drums cracked the air. The beat was constant and frightening, and the people of Confitachete danced and prayed. It was their autumn harvest, and their crops were great and plentiful. And although the Spanish expected an ambush at any moment, the Indians of Confitachete seemed calm and tranquil. And what made it all the stranger was that they seemed not at all apprehensive nor surprised of the Spanish arrival. On the first day, Soto ordered his men to stay in position. He called a dozen scouts to go forth and explore the territory. As the army reached an elongated area, several tribesmen bid them welcome. Ortiz made his way to the front of the line and took control of translation. Soto stood still and listened. The translators pointed and grunted. Painfully, Soto turned to Ortiz, and Ortiz relayed. They say there is an elder lady queen, but she is not present at the moment. There was a long silence. The tribesmen continued. The translators pointed. Ortiz relayed again. But in charge of this land is her younger niece. Bring forth this lady, said Soto. They say she will come to us, said Ortiz. After another minute of deliberation, the tribesmen asked Soto and Ortiz to follow them down to a river, and Soto begrudgingly obliged. Then finally, the food was offered, and the Spanish delightfully gorged on pounds of fish, loaves, and corn. The Spanish requested more, and more was delivered. And the sounds of smacks and gulps and long, satisfying sighs filled the air. The next morning, Soto assembled 2 divisions and commanded the rest of the army to stay put. The group followed the slaves down to a river and were repeatedly told that the lady of the land was to bid them their official welcome. They arrived at the banks of the river and waited a whole hour. Then they waited for another, and Soto and Ortiz stared at the river and the hollowed-out trees on either end. But then a sound hurtled past the land. Then a cry. Then a yell. The beating of drums soon followed, and the men pointed to a raft floating in the river. The tribesmen rushed out to the edge of the river and kneeled before the craft. The procession began, and the drums beat louder and louder. Is that her, Ortiz? Yes, Don Hernando. That is the lady. And on the edge of the raft, the lady of Confitachete stood. She wore a white gown, and her black hair whipped in the wind. 8 women servants came upon the raft and tended to her, and as the Spanish tried to get a closer view, the slaves held up a high wooden platform and lowered it to the raft. The lady then took her chair and was raised high upon the platform, and the servants below drew her out from the water and onto the banks. Her subjects bowed. She sat still. Then her platform lowered, and she got up from her chair and walked on to the sands. She strolled in slow and calculated strides, and as she came closer into view, all grew lost in her beauty, and none more than Soto. The lady stared strangely at the assembly of Spaniards, priests, and slaves. She was not more than 20 years old, but her face looked sullen. She whispered a prayer underneath her breath. She swayed her head and stood alone. Then she picked up a thorn stick and ran her finger along the edge until blood dripped down her side. Soto slowly made his way towards her. He approached gently with even steps. He sauntered and waltzed, making sure his boots did not make a sound. But when the lady was closer into view, Soto became unbalanced. He looked straight into her eyes and did not let go of her gaze. And the lady looked back with a blank stare. When the silence was too much to bear, Soto spoke. And for the first time since he was a child, Soto stuttered. Your lady, I must oblige in saying that I'm captivated by your beauty and your land. We come, lands, we come far away. Ortiz relayed, then the lady nodded and spoke. Her words were stern and dignified, and she spoke in soft and bellowing tones. And at all times, she remained calm. She says we are welcome guests, said Ortiz. They call me Child of the Sun, said Soto. In truth, But the lady interrupted. Again she spoke with grace, but this time it was short and diplomatic. She says she knows, said Ortiz. She says we will feed your men. Her land is plenty, and she is honored that she has found you. Her words seemed to taper in the air, and Soto stared again once more into her smiling eyes. His whole face had softened, as if it had thawed from a deep winter freeze. Tell her we are very grateful. Tell her that she is very beautiful. His gaze continued. The lady stared at him, but there was only silence. Sir? You were saying, sir? I've seen her before. The lady? Yes. Where? In a dream. A dream? A horrendous dream. The minute passed, and so did the afternoon. The grunts and commotions of the men continued, and a wide and strange fascination took over. The lady turned her way back to the servants and disappeared into one of the houses. But Soto did not follow. Instead, he stayed standing and examined the land to and fro with a look of immense joy. And for the rest of the day and night, he did not utter a single word. Towards the morning of the next day, the men corralled the dogs and horses, and as promised, the lady of Confitachete granted the Spanish more food. Servants entered the field and went to work, and towards midday they brought the Spanish hundreds of bushels of corn, beans, and squash. Soto delegated his orders. His men joined the hunters and fishermen of Confitachete. The hunters managed to catch 3 elk and 1 doe. The fishermen, however, had a tremendous day. They caught 50 bushels of striped bass, flounders, and porgies. The ebb and flow of the waters temporarily made the Spanish calm, and after the initial days of feeding, it seemed as if the Spanish were finally regaining their strength. A day went by, then another. The Spanish found no gold. Instead, they found more Indian slaves, and they auctioned them off to the highest bidder. And while the army stayed in Cufitachete and rested, Soto stayed by the princess of the land, whom he affectionately referred to as the lady. He asked for privacy at all times and shared many evenings with her alone. They watched the crescent moon fall upon a ghostly sky. Her charm was simply overwhelming, and every time Soto looked into her eyes, he grew spellbound and lost in her trance. The camp seared with smoke, and the Spanish ate more, but the natives of Cofitachete made sure to keep their distance from them. The captains sat and voiced their own opinions. Hector and Vicente, too, shared their thoughts. It was approaching a year since they left Spain, and they had forgotten much of it. "I have a feeling, Hector," said Vicente. "What feeling?" "I don't know. I just have a feeling." "What is it?" "This land seems very rich. Richer than all of La Florida." "It is." "I think we'll find it." "No, I know we'll find it. We've come too far." "That we have," said Hector. "But when?" "Soon. This lady. I feel she'll bring us there." "Let's pray you're right, Vicente." A day passed, and Soto ordered several platoons to march north through the hills. They found thick, dense marshes that went on for many miles, and they followed the slaves to the taller trees. From there, they spotted a stream that was once said to have carried silver. For 5 straight hours, they dug and panned and searched, but there was no silver of any kind. And when the men reported back to their captains, the captains turned to Soto. But he was nowhere to be found. Miles away in the secluded woods, the lady and Soto walked alone. And throughout the afternoon, the lady guided Soto and showed him her world. They strolled through the green, rolling hills, and along the budding blossoms of lilies, they held hands. Soto could feel eyes watching him. He switched his view in constant alert, but as time passed, his vigilance and restlessness wore away. Then the happy silence replaced every fear, and he looked deeper into the lady's eyes and fell into the moment. They rested along the shade of a great oak tree, and Soto's eyes grew deep and heavy. He lay his head on the lady's lap and fell into a deep sleep. The lady remained calm and played with Soto's thin hair. Then she spoke aloud in soft and faint whispers. She spoke of the trees and the mountain west. She spoke of the streams, the hills and the mounds, the history of her people, the ancient mound builders, and all of the ancient spirits of Cofitachete. But, with no translators present, her words drifted into the air and vanished. And when she finished, Soto awoke and smiled at her. Then, Soto said words of his own. "I know there is much more." And as the sun waned, Soto and the lady of Cofitachete walked together again. And when the stars emerged in the sky, Soto made it back to camp alone. He arrived at his tent and saw his men gathered to greet him. But Soto merely waved his hands and sighed. Another hot and humid day arrived. In the morning, the lady and the elder chieftains of Cofitachete held a meeting with the Spanish near the banks of a small river. Soto gathered near Ortiz and the lady, and as Ortiz relayed the information to Soto, his captains waited on the banks and listened. "She says there's a land north by the river. She will take us there," said Ortiz. An hour later, 10 canoes landed near the edge of the sand. The Spanish boarded 10 men to each canoe, and Soto, taking the lady by her hand, escorted her down to the edge of the longest canoe, and they sat at each other's side. The river surged with continuous sounds of slushes and pools. The current strengthened, and the canes bobbed up and down, and the slaves rowed for another hour. But then the river settled. They stopped in the middle of the water, and there was no shade at all. It became very still and brown. The Spanish sweated through their armor, and their faces were red and filled with blisters. The heat came from all around, and each man's face looked as if it was about to boil. And through the river, a peaceful but eerie silence lingered. The sky soon became filled with clouds, and Soto gazed beyond and slipped deep into his dream. He muttered to himself, and when he opened his eyes back up, the lady smiled and concentrated on the river. A brisk wind had formed, then a faint drizzle fell onto the canoes and pinged and patted against the Spanish armor. Then the lady pointed several times east. She repeated the phrase, and Ortiz relayed. "She says it's just a little further." And the river went on. Her servants were summoned near a giant oak tree. They spotted an old man wearing rags and holding a cane. His face was weathered and worn. His eyes were dim and gray. The lady bowed and kneeled. And then the old man spoke. Soto drew Ortiz and his translators forward. The old man finished speaking, and the lady raised her hand. She then commanded her servants to go forth, and the Spanish followed. About an eighth of a mile later, the lady stopped. Then she spoke in a quiet, honorable tone, and Ortiz relayed, and the translation followed. "About 10 moons ago, several of our men walked about and discovered this. We assumed it was given by some gods that looked very much like you," said Ortiz. The servants came across a soft patch of dirt and dug into the soil with their bare hands. Seeing this, the Spanish roared like ravaged hyenas. They rushed to the spot and dug with their swords, and the whole of Soto's men burst out with screams of ecstasy. They dug inside, and the dirt flowed in all directions. And because there wasn't enough room, and because the servants worked slow, the Spanish threw off the servants one by one. They dug deeper in fervent haste. They hacked and dug and cursed and swung wildly. And Soto watched with utter certainty as the lady stood by his side. Then one soldier swung his axe. It made a clear, hollow, and distinct sound. The men clawed into the dirt, uncovered an object, and brought it to the surface. All stared at a rotted wooden chest that was covered in moss and cobwebs. It was the size of a small table. But for the Spanish, it remained the most important thing in the world. Soto placed his hands on the chest and opened up the lid. Inside were pieces of gold and sapphire, 100 pieces of rubies and emeralds, tiny coins of Inca gold, sapphire, and slanted chunks of silver. Soto held each piece and lowered his head. Then he cried, and the Spanish hollered and embraced each other. The lady spoke once more, but her words were muddled by shouts and screams. Then Ortiz took the helm and relayed what she said. "They are strange, but beautiful gods," said Ortiz. Soto rose to his feet and spoke. And once again, he gazed into her eyes. "Ortiz, tell her, let it be known that this is what we're after, that this, in our hearts, is the treasure we seek, and that we are forever grateful for her and for her people." And like all days, the sun died into night. Throughout the next days and nights, word spread of the treasure, and the whole of Cofitachete seemed to erupt with excitement. The Spanish were enthralled, and the celebration commenced. For the day and the moment had finally arrived. The camps were littered with bottles of wine, and the men finally opened the bottles they saved since Cuba. They screamed and danced. They devoured and gorged the sweet and majestic juice of the vine, and the people of Cofitachete watched from afar with fright, not knowing what these beasts would do next. The captains all examined the treasure and confirmed its validity. They huddled over their tent, and they too shared a bottle of old fine wine, and they too finally looked alive. "That's Inca gold. There's no doubt about it. Sapphire, too. But where did it come from? From the north, perhaps. It couldn't possibly be from the north, unless the land goes further out. This land is so vast, there's no telling where it came from. It might have come from the mountains. Wherever it came from, it's a blessing. It means that we're closer than we realize. It's paltry. Yes, it's paltry. But our work is finally paying off. We'll search this land inch by inch. We shall." Beyond the captain's tent, in the dense fire of the men, Hector and Vicente too shared their thoughts. They sat next to each other in the glowing hum of dusk, watched the sun cast over to the bright noon, and ate their meal of corn and beans, which somehow tasted sweeter than the day before. They were veterans now, bitter and angry, but still intrigued. The thrill they had when they left Spain had finally returned, and each time they looked at each other, they giggled, knowing all the pain they had suffered and endured. "I told you, Hector. I told you this day would come." "That you did, Vicente. I told you when I get those feelings, I just know." "Do you think we'll find more?" "I know we'll find more." Then Hector sighed. For a moment, he looked sad and wistful. Vicente turned and squinted. "What's wrong?" "I don't know," said Hector. "What don't you know?" "It's just, I wish Canales was here." "So do I," said Vicente. "But when you're gone, you're gone." Then Hector fell asleep, and Vicente watched his friend slip deeper into his own thoughts, clearly overwhelmed. "Your father would be proud, Hector," said Vicente. "I know," said Hector. "His son followed his footsteps, went through the unknown, went through hell, and came back a conquistador." "I know. It just seems..." "Seems what, Hector?" "It just seems impossible." "What seems impossible?" said Vicente. "Everything. Everything," said Hector. Vicente did not respond. He finished his bottle, stared at the North Star, and prayed. Then he handed the bottle over to Hector. "Drink some more. You think too much." And as the day went on, all eyes were on Soto. But he gave no further orders. Soto remained alone for hours at a time. He was lost in thought and wonder. He ran his hair through his hands and walked over to the blacksmith and spent the majority of his day there, marveling once again at their labor. He watched the smiths work away as they hammered out new steel and repaired old swords. Through the steam and embers of the fire, the men saluted Soto, and Soto saluted back. The rhythms of blows and sifts and chinks continued for hours. They were the sounds of Toledo. They were the sounds of old and methodical methods that were proper and sanctified. They were the sounds of pain and sheer determination that created new bounty. Sharp and beautiful steel that ruled all the known and unknown. And sensing this, Soto closed his eyes and felt a great peace. The heat rose to an unbearable pitch, but hour after hour the smiths persisted. They wiped off their sweaty brows, and their bodies turned into globs of melting red skin. But Soto remained along their side, given nothing but looks of pride and sheer admiration. And when a new sword was finally finished, one of the smiths offered it to Soto, and Soto accepted the sword with grace and honor. An hour later, Soto returned. Beside him lay the rotted chest of wood and its treasure. Soto lay on his stomach and slowly reached out his hands. He imagined each piece of treasure and the year's worth of hell. Again, Soto closed his eyes and nodded. Pools of drool ran down from his face. There were 10 pieces of sapphire, blue as majestic as the sea. Soto held them in his hands and inhaled a deep and encompassing breath. He did the same with the silver, and lastly, he did the same with the gold. All the power and the glory, he had now possessed it. Each gem was a spirit unto itself, and when there were no more pieces left to hold, he placed them back inside the chest and said a short and convincing prayer to a god he had long forgotten about. The next day came, and all remained peaceful in Confitachete. In the morning, Soto ordered Anasco and Balthasar to head a force north and explore the territories beyond the place where they had found their first treasure. And the rest of the army patrolled the lands south and west. At noon, both Alvas and Rangel reported back to Soto and ran the litanies of their inventory and journal entries to him. And Soto nodded and affirmed with minimal attention. When they were finished, Soto dismissed the two and searched far and wide for the lady. He found her an hour later, sitting along the shallow waters, and given no further orders, Alvas and Rangel went back to their respective tents and prepared their daily entries, and they noted all they had recalled. It is currently the 29th of March, 1540, and we have approached day 304 of the Entrada de la Florida. With cautious and humble accuracy, I, Raquel, the governor's secretary, report the following inventory catalogue. In regards to deaths, 25. In regards to injured and severely sick, 52. In regards to missing and presumed dead, 17. In regards to food, for many months the stockpile was in dire need of restoring. However, due to the great abundance of the Confitachete land, the food inventory has greatly been replenished, and all 20 wagons of the previous winter are well stocked with grains, corn, dried beans, and cured fish. In regards to food lost, we have slaughtered some 350 pigs and have lost at least 25 of them. 3 days ago, we had slaughtered the very last dozen. They were divided into 16 pieces each, with each platoon taking a calculated portion. Also on that day, we had butchered 2 oxen. For the small and large artillery, the inventory now remains as follows: 16 cannons, all in proper working condition, 185 arquebuses, 211 crossbows, and 33 cases of gunpowder. For the cavalry and general army, it will be reported in the following weeks, since not an accurate number has been established. Duly noted in humble regards, Gentlemen of Rancal, 29th March, 1540. Beyond the valley was 200 leagues over mountainous territory, and from predictions we would have to cross over very rough and high mountains. But the governor remained focused and steadfast upon the land, which the Indians called Confitachete. In our initial meeting, 20 Indians came out to meet him, each carrying a basket of mulberries, walnuts, and plums. And in Confitachete land, we were provided enough food and hope. We met upon a queen who was dressed in a white gown and welcomed us with grace. During the next days, this queen of Confitachete showed us her vast lands, and on one particular day, she showed the governor a chest filled with sapphire, gold, and silver. We asked for more, and on the 18th of March, the army headed north to a broad land of swamp and deep water. And from that point, great joy spread over to the entire army, for it finally seemed that our expectations of this land were met, and that more plentiful gifts were bound to follow. Gentlemen of Alvas, April 1st, 1540. But still, Soto remained in a daze, and when the desire had overwhelmed him, he spent nights with the lady of Confitachete. But knowing that he was watched, not by his own guards, but by the tribesmen, he kept in vigilant behavior. Needless to say, this facade did not last very long. 2 days later, Soto ordered his men to leave him and the lady alone. He requested each captain to patrol a given area and not to go within 3 miles of the town. "Now's not the time to venture," he said to them. "Now's the time to rest." The men complied, and with their request granted, Soto and the lady of Confitachete remained completely alone. They were miles away in a distant wooded area, where no servants, guard, or slave, or any man of any nature was present. And in his privacy, Soto took the lady by her hand, and they sauntered through the lands and streams. Her white gown was now sullen in hues of brown and green, and in the wind-whipped air, they made their way onto the banks. Then the lady pulled on Soto's arms and led him onwards through the trees, where they walked for a long half-mile. When they grew tired, they stopped near a shaded slope. Then Soto looked into the lady's small eyes, grabbed her arms, and kissed her long and hard. And for hours they made love and ignored the rest of the world. And for hours they made love and ignored the rest of the world. The next day Soto awoke, but the lady was already standing. She grabbed his arm, and they walked further along the streams. They walked for an hour, and Soto looked all about. "Where are you taking me?" said Soto. But his reply went unanswered. The lady just smiled, rubbed his arm, and blinked her eyes. Soto peered up top the trees, though there was nothing in sight. There was no sound. There was only the ceaseless hum of birds and insects. They discovered a large stream 10 miles later, and the lady walked off, bent down, and dipped her hands in the water, and Soto followed her. Then he stopped and looked over to a glistening light. He saw a bed of oyster shells covered in green and brown corals. and about a minute later, the lady returned to Soto with 2 large gray shells in her hands. She handed him the shells, but Soto looked confused. She said 2 words and repeated them, but Soto shook his head, noting he did not understand what she said. The lady then opened her oyster with her hands and slurped out the meat with 1 gulp. She waited for Soto to do the same. Soto imitated the lady, but he fumbled the oyster, and it slid in and out of his hands. He squeezed the shell by its end, and for long, painful minutes, he tried to pry it open. But he could not. Then Soto took out his knife and slit the shell. In doing so, he cut his hands on the spike, and the blood squirted out and smeared onto his armor, and dripped to the water below. The lady then took back the oyster, cracked it open, and handed it back to Soto. They both stood still and silent, but the lady looked very sad. They made a small fire as the sun went down, and as night came, they made love again. But Soto would not let go of her. He clutched onto her body, and he cradled his hand on her laps as if he were a child, and he fell into a deep, long sleep. For half an hour, neither said a word. The lady breathed in and out and did not blink, and Soto closed his eyes, still with his head in her lap. She watched his chest go up and down, and she heard him snore loudly. Then the lady pulled Soto's head away from her. Soto's lips hit the sand, and when the lady turned over, she sat up and peered deep into the black heavens. In the full moonlight, they sat across from each other and stared at the growing fire. The air turned cold and damp, and Soto remained lost in thought. Then, when she deemed it time, the lady presented Soto with another gift. It was a string of pearls she made while he slept. She wiped the dirt off and placed it around his neck. "They're beautiful," he said. He looked again at her face and held her hair with his fingers. But the lady yawned with tired eyes. He took off the necklace and stared at it for a minute. Then he stared once again to the lady's flat nose and small eyes. And in the silence, Soto sat by the lady and watched her every move. He tried to come up with words to say to her, knowing full well she would not understand a single one. But he said the words anyway. Words that meant so much and captured more. But words the lady could never understand. Still, Soto said them. He lost sense of time, and the words poured out of him. "I saw you in a dream. I know you will show us everything. My mother used to sing a song to me every night. I forget it now. I used to know it. You'll remind me, won't you? Please." By the river, towards the rising sun, remind me, remind me. "Please remind me," he repeated. "By the river." But the lady shook her head. His words rang flat and empty, and the lady stared, not understanding the word he said. Then she closed her eyes and fell asleep. The full moon peaked and radiated, and in Confitaceti land, many men had awoken. Hector's hand shook as he gasped for air. Beside him, Vicente yawned and swatted at flies. Another day had passed. The savannah heat emerged once again, and the Spanish pressed onward through the grass. I had a dream last night, said Vicente. It was the same dream I had the night before. Go on, said Hector. I was an old man, but I was a rich man, a very rich man. And I lived on a beautiful island. I lived in the castle, and it was mine, all mine, Hector. And all the gold I ever found was in that castle. Mine to hold, to protect. I was named King. What happened next? Said Hector. Then came the invaders. I saw their ships, and I prepared my army. And then? Then I woke up. What about your dream, Hector? Tell me your dream. I don't really remember. Go on, you'll remember. No, you'll think it's stupid. Go on, tell me your stupid dream. Hector paused, but then it came back to him. All I remembered was the land. It was a beautiful, green, peaceful land, and I remembered walking through it. What else? Said Vicente. That's what I remember. Walking? What kind of dream is that? Walking. Were you alone? No, I wasn't alone. There were others. Strangers. They were walking too. We all knew each other. But it wasn't the dream that mattered. It was the feeling. What did you feel? I felt a great peace. But what else? What about the treasure? There wasn't any treasure. No treasure? No treasure? No gold? No silver? Then what? What was the point? Hector gave no response. Vicente looked on to the other men. Then he sighed and turned away. Enough about dreams. We have a busy day. Come on, Hector. Let's go. Soto returned to the camp with a lady by his side. He had assembled his men and declared that she would show them the gifts she had promised. And for those hours, the army paced east to the shore. The men muttered and scowled. Their boots sank in the sands, and when they saw the depths of the water, the lady stopped and pointed. All stood perplexed. What is this? One man cried. I don't understand. There were no words or reply. Soto greeted the lady. She bent down to the surface, retrieved the string of pearls, and placed it around his head. Then 24 of her servants climbed the sand hills and appeared with shells and bundles of grass. The elder statesman entered and spoke to the Spanish aloud. These pearls, Ortiz surmised, these are the eyes of the world. And Soto stood and stared. The servants made their way to the men and laid out a large tarp of deerskin. The Spanish looked at it, and below they saw a multitude of clear small pearls, white goblets of round and holy purity, 1/2 bushel in all. Then the lady spoke. She says these pearls are for you, said Ortiz. For all the gifts of this land we share. Soto stuttered. Then he waved his hands and said no more. The day ended, and the men made their fires. Their voices cracked with excitement, but an unresolved misery and suspicion lingered, and the men said what was on their minds. Only pearls? I didn't kill myself only for pearls. It's only an appetizer. They are beautiful pearls, though. But there has to be more. There must be. More. Tomorrow. We'll find it all tomorrow. We'll search every goddamn inch. I don't know. I think they hid it in the temples. Hid what? Everything. How do you know? I just know. We've waited. We waited too fucking long. Days continued. The lady summoned a young man to lead the Spanish onward through the hills. The young man stood tall, lean, and gangly, and although his face was very brave, he held a forever confused expression. He was said to be the lady's cousin. Moscoso's men joined Balthasar's, and soon 150 men marched along the wide mounds of the sand dunes, and the young man guided them all. The servants repeatedly stated that the land possessed many quarries of silver just beyond the hills, but when they arrived, the Spanish found no quarry of any kind. The next day, Soto assembled his captains and gave his orders. I've asked the lady to show us more of the land, and she has complied. Juan Anasco? Yes, Don Hernando. Move your men 3 miles south. The rest will gather upon the rendezvous point, where we are to follow the lady. There is more to find, and we'll find it today. An hour later, the Spanish found shiny metals along a stretch of jagged rocks. However, all of it was copper, which was next to worthless to the Spanish. Ask them for more, Ortiz, said Soto. The night came. The people of Cofitachete performed and danced a long procession. Their prayer was to their falcon god, whom they waited 5 years to arrive. As the dances proceeded, the priests held a vigil. They bellowed and prayed loudly, trying to drown out all the Indian shouts, but the constant drumming did not cease. More days passed, and more disappointments followed. The Spanish followed more trails and found acres of corn and squash. They ate hearty meals, but found no silver or gold. And soon the spring rains raced along the coast and stayed. Again, they found more lands and thriving villages with thousands of people among them. The Spanish found more beans, more corn, more squash and gourds. But they found no metal, iron, or jewels. The young man showed all the lands, but the Spanish wanted more. Finally, they pointed towards the temples, and as the day came to an end, the young man wept. The Spanish insisted that they show them the temples, but the young man retorted, "We've shown you all the lands." It was still not enough, and when the Spanish threatened him with their swords and barked their orders, they pointed back to the temples again, and the young native looked back with great pain. "You are forbidden. They are only for the dead." But the Spanish took no heed. They ventured on and seized every temple, striking and decapitated anyone who stood in their way. "This is the land we belong to. It births us all. It is all we know. How can you take it?" But the young man's plea went unanswered, and the Spanish whipped him across his back. The Spanish ransacked the temples and searched for their fortune. They struck each totem pole and poked holes in their hard wood. They uncovered blankets and quilts, and they set aflame buffalo skin and straw. They yelled and shrieked and hollered, but after a half an hour, they found nothing. And an hour later, nothing still. Then they took their rage onto the slaves and lashed them with their whips. The young man yelled and screamed and ran. The Spanish gave chase and unleashed their dogs, but by then he was covered in a pool of his own blood. The young man had stabbed himself in the stomach with a pointed stone, and the Spanish watched him bleed. Another night fell. The captains huddled by their fires. Among those present were Balthazar, Moscoso, Juananasco, Bedima, Tobar, and Tinaco. Soto, however, remained alone. What are we doing? God, would I like to know. Have any of you spoke with Don Hernando? No. Have you? Yes, only this morning. What did he say? Nothing, as usual. He just gave out his orders. What did your men find? Pearls. Only pearls? Only pearls. No gold? None. Silver? None. Only pearls. Pearls? Wonders of wonder. But what about our rations? Didn't you mention it to him? No, only to Ortiz. Pah! Ortiz. What about him? He's blind for one. We're following a blind man. It's so obvious I can't even laugh about it anymore. He's been helpful. Yes, he's been helpful, but he's been very vague. I blame the guides more than I blame Ortiz. At least Ortiz is Spanish. He might be blind, but I'll never doubt his loyalty. Their talk subsided. Most of the captains left. Only Balthazar and Moscoso remained. You seem to know more about Don Hernando than most, Luis, said Balthazar. He trusts you more than most. Yes, I suppose, said Moscoso. So tell me, what is he doing? He's waiting for a move. But even you must admit there's no gold here. If we settle here, if we build here, Don Hernando will not settle. That's what I'm afraid of. It's as if he's lost. Lost? In a dream. Like he always is. And so he was. About a quarter of a mile from the camp, Soto sat beside the lady. Her face was filled with fear. Her whole body trembled. Then Soto reached his hand into the flame, but gave no reaction of pain. The lady gasped and looked away, but Soto continued to stare deep into her eyes. And the misery lingered. The misery morphed into anger. Anger grew to rage. And the days of peace in Confitachete were over. One man in Balthazar's group had vanished and was reported missing for several days. The men searched up and down the marsh. It was Hector who found him. He pointed, and all stared at a corpse that was tied to a tree. The Spaniard's entire face had been mangled. The next day, another body was found. It was the youngest in Tanaco's unit, Brother Alberto. 3 more bodies were found. All were hung and burnt. When Soto glanced at the bodies, he showed little emotion. He muttered a prayer and walked away. And for the rest of the afternoon, Soto searched for the lady. He followed the stream down the wild cotton and birch trees. A strong wind blew, and white tips of cotton swirled like snow. And the sky was filled with clouds. Soto smelled the burning fires, and his eyes shuddered back and forth. The smell of the fire pierced his nostrils, and he coughed uncontrollably. In the swirl of the ash, Soto squinted. He opened his hands and repeated the phrase. My lady. An hour later, The sun had died, but still the phrase lingered. My lady. He took another trail between tall pines and taller sycamores. He inched forward, slow, then slower. He peered within the trees. He saw shadows. Then he found her. She stood beside the birch tree. Her gown sauntered in the air, and Soto moved in closer. My lady. The archers set their sights. They leaned high up top the sycamores, and Soto's head came into focus. They aimed. They fired. But their arrows missed. Soto stared at the lady again, and the next arrows fired. One arrow missed. The other clanged off Soto's armor. And when Soto turned, a warrior with an axe charged right at him. Cannon fire exploded in the sky. A loud eruption struck the trees, and Soto saw the knife slash across the warrior's neck. Screams came out from the distance. They were Spanish screams. They called out his name. Don Hernando! Don Hernando! The screams were followed by more cannon fire, barks, and the shouts of soldiers rushing through the marsh. And the archers up top the canopy fled into the night. Another voice screamed, Don Hernando! Don Hernando! And Soto saw Moscoso's face as he stood by the warrior's corpse. Soto was still shocked. He looked all over. He looked to the streams and again to the withered hands. Then he looked at the lady, who stood 100 yards away. He stared, and she stared right back at him, with sad, harkened eyes, as tears fell down her cheek. And Soto seethed with pure rage. He pointed and yelled, Chain her! The lady ran, but the Spanish tackled her to the ground and chained her hands and feet. The lady cried and whimpered, but Soto looked away. Moscoso. Yes, Don Hernando. Burn it. Burn the whole town. Moscoso nodded, and within minutes, his men carried forth their order, and Conquistadors was lit asunder. The Spanish threw torch after torch as faces disappeared in the black and billowing plumes of smoke that engulfed the entire sky. The temples, the huts, the granaries, and anything that stood were all lit asunder. The lady found herself by her servants. They too were chained, and they too cried as they watched their whole world burn. And all through the hours, more cries rang out through time and space. The elders were thrown to the ground and burnt alive. The native women of Conquistadors were raped and left for dead. And the native children ran away. But then, the cries subsided. And what was heard then were nothing but the cindering sounds of fallen ash, hacks and coughs, and bodies inflamed. Night had fallen, and the madness continued.